Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. In the next 1.5 hours, we'll be presenting 3 talks on plant-based nutrition. My name is Dr. Leila Dehkan. I'm a nutritionist at Plant-Based Health Online, and I'm also the education lead at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK. We at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK are very grateful to VegFest for giving us the opportunity to share the latest evidence on nutrition and health with you. And as we have only 30 minutes, I'm going to keep it really short. I just want to mention that, you're welcome to visit our website. I'll post a link to the website, and we have a lot of fact sheets, many videos on plant-based diets, and on our website. And you can also support our work by becoming a member. There are some benefits to being a member. I'm again not going to go into it. You can check it on our website. So without further ado, the first speaker is Dr. Shireen Kassam, the founder of Plant-Based Health Professionals UK and a consultant hematologist at King's College London. Hi Shireen, welcome.
Oh, hi Leila, thanks very much and for putting together a wonderful programme. It's great to kick it off today. So we'll start off with my slides, but for people who don't know me, we founded Plant-Based Health Professionals back in 2018 and hopefully going from strength to strength. So I'm looking forward to really sharing a really interesting topic. I didn't realise how interesting and abundant the data were and wish I had an hour to cover this. So do share my slides and hopefully I can see them at the same time as well. So just moving on to the first slide today. If you could just move to the next slide. What I thought I would just summarise before I get into the detail is that I've been really following this data on diet and COVID-19 from the get-go, really, from March 2020. I've written 3 articles now that you can check out on our website under the news section or on medium.com. And this is just going to provide an overview. So first of all, we made observations based on prior data from infections such as influenza and pneumonias that a healthy diet was going to be important in supporting our immune system during the pandemic. Shortly into the pandemic, it was noted that those with chronic underlying conditions had a worse severity when they did get the infection. And it was later realised that this severe infection was driven by excessive inflammation and also by poor vascular health. We've also now learnt that high cholesterol and glucose drives the severity of COVID-19. And we know that the health of the gut microbiome is really important. And just in the last couple of months, there have been 2 large studies that really show us very compelling data that a plant-based diet may be a powerful tool in reducing the severity of COVID-19. So next slide, please. So we started off at the beginning of the pandemic where everyone, including myself, was writing about how a healthy diet might support our immune system and the pandemic resilience. And this was the information from the WHO, essentially telling us to eat a variety of foods, particularly fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, in their unprocessed forms, cut back on salt, which we know promotes hypertension, but also we forget that it also damages the gut microbiome. Eating our fatty acids from plant sources, so unsaturated fats such as nuts and seeds and olive oil, and limiting sugar intake because this increases the risk of chronic disease and also inflammation. Obviously, water for thirst is most important, and avoid hazardous compounds such as alcohol, which we know adversely impact the immune system. Next slide. Now, our immune system is complicated and it really is there to protect against infections and toxins. But if it's overactive, you might get conditions such as autoimmune diseases. And really cancer, for example, is a problem with the immune system because we're not managing to adequately remove cancerous cells. So there's inadequate immune surveillance. On the left-hand side, you can see that in the purple, there's our innate immune system, which is things like the tears in our eyes or the lining of the respiratory system or the barrier function of the skin that sort of keep out the toxins and infections that we're exposed to all the time. And I'll come back to the gut microbiome because it's key in our resilience against infection. And on the left-hand side, you can see the adaptive immune system. We have the non-specific response. So when we first see an infection, the cells such as neutrophils and macrophages come into play and try and fight the infection. And then soon after a few days or even weeks, we get the more specific immune response to that particular infection, where the B cells produce specific antibodies, the T cell response is more specific, and then this creates a sort of a memory effect. So these cells that can fight that particular infection stay dormant and then can be reactivated if you get exposed again, which hopefully means that you're immune, or at least have a very reduced severity the second time around. Next slide. And we know that the factors that are important in keeping our immune system healthy are listed here. Now, as we age, there's a natural decline, but we can help support that through a healthy diet and lifestyle. Chronic illness impairs our immune system. The medications we use to treat these illnesses can also suppress the immune system. Environmental factors such as air pollution and other toxins. And as I say, diet is something I'm going to concentrate on today. So next slide. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, lots of researchers wrote really good articles, and I've got a reference there at the bottom from the BMJ Nutrition Journal. And in addition to meeting calorie requirements and your protein requirements, it's really important to get a range of micronutrients, vitamins, minerals that are listed here that are abundant and plentiful in a healthy vegan diet. The caveat to that is obviously vitamin B12, which you need to get ideally from supplements. And Rohini Bajekal will be going through some of these key nutrients in her talk at 1:30, so do join her. Next slide. What was realized early on, and these data you can see are from February last year from China, that people with underlying health conditions had a vastly increased risk of dying. And these conditions were cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, respiratory disease, and high blood pressure. And since then, we have got a more robust data from the US and the UK showing that more than 70% of cases that result in ITU admissions or death are in people with underlying health conditions. Next slide. And if you go back to data from 2019, we know that a diet is the key driver to these underlying health conditions. This was a study from 195 countries around the world, and it showed that diet is the single most important predictor of health outcomes globally. It's the leading predictor of premature death, resulting in 1 in 5 deaths globally, that it predicts for chronic disease, and that overall our diet quality is the leading predictor of longevity and vitality. Next slide. Now, early on in the pandemic, we realized that uncontrolled inflammation was driving this excessive response and then poor outcome with the virus. And you can see depicted in this diagram in the pink cells at the top, firstly on the left, the virus goes into the cell through the ACE receptor and it overwhelms that cell, and which ultimately gets damaged and dies. And when it dies, there's inflammatory signals and cytokines released. And this does two things. It activates macrophages, and it also in itself activates the T cells. But this macrophage activation at the bottom in the green then goes on to activate T cells, which then forms this sort of circular two-way positive loop that keeps creating inflammation and cytokines that then drive this inflammation. And we know that inflammation is driven by aging, and not much we can do about that other than adopt a healthy diet and lifestyle, but also carrying excess weight, these underlying health conditions. And we can choose a diet that's full of anti-inflammatory foods, like a healthy plant-based diet, and we can undertake physical activity and adequate sleep and stress-relieving activities that will also dampen down inflammation. Next slide. Now, it was also very clear early on that this illness was not just a disease of the lungs, even though the respiratory tract takes in the infection to start with, but it was a multi-system disease, and actually it was driven by infection into the endothelium cells, and these endothelial cells are a single cell layer coating the 60,000 miles of our blood vessels. So these endothelial cells have ACE receptors, and therefore the vascular system gets infected as well and damaged. And so this damage to the vascular system leads to inflammation, it impairs the immune system, it leads to thrombosis, and really can affect any part of the body. So the loss of smell, the inflammation of the heart, COVID toe. This is all caused by infection of the vascular system, which either causes a vasculitis, which is inflammation, or it promotes blood vessels to become clotted, so small clots in their extremities and in the brain, for example, can also cause a stroke. Next slide. Now, a key part of vascular health, but also in general, is keeping our blood cholesterol level low. And we've realized that high levels of cholesterol, particularly in the tissues, is a driver of getting the virus into the cells. So high cholesterol in the cells results in more ACE receptors on the surface, and this means that more virus gets into the cell that ultimately then creates inflammation and cytokine storm. Now, what's in the tissue is not exactly the same as the blood cholesterol, but there is a correlation. So people with higher blood cholesterol will have higher levels of tissue cholesterol, and we know that diet is a major driver of blood cholesterol levels, with those on a plant-based diet having the lowest levels, but also other drivers of high tissue level, again, aging, never a good thing, cardiovascular disease, being overweight, and type 2 diabetes. Next slide. Now, there's been a lot of research on blood glucose and COVID outcomes. Now, 3 main observations have been made. Firstly, that people with type 2 diabetes have increased severity from this disease and a higher chance of dying. That when you're ill with COVID and those people going to ITU, they have a higher blood cholesterol level that seems to be driving the inflammation and the thrombosis that happens. And thirdly, something we don't fully understand is that after recovery, people have an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And this paper that's just recently been published brings together data from 240,000 open access studies and used a machine learning tool to seek out the bits that were relevant to blood glucose and COVID-19. And what it found was that every aspect of the virus is facilitated by having a high blood glucose level. So not only does high blood glucose level increase the chances of the virus getting into the cell, it increases replication, it increases the cytokine storm, and ultimately the organ dysfunction that's seen with it. And then, of course, we come back to the fact that a healthy diet can help keep your blood glucose at the lowest level possible and prevent and reverse type 2 diabetes. Next slide. Now, a fascinating thing is that 70% of our immune system actually resides in the gut. And of course, our diet really is the key player in keeping our gut healthy. And when we're talking about gut health, we're talking about the trillions of microorganisms that reside in our gut. We mostly know about the bacteria, but we have viruses and yeast and protozoa and all sorts of things. And fiber and polyphenols in our diet are really key to keeping the gut microbiome healthy. And when we feed our gut microbiome adequately, they create these metabolites or compounds called short-chain fatty acids, which stimulate our immune cells. And this actually creates a healthy immune system in our gut, but actually in all different body organs, because these chemicals signal throughout the body and create a healthy immune system at places that are very distant from the gut. So, for example, there's communication between the gut and the lung, and the health of the gut impacts the lung immune system. It also signals to the brain, and we also know that it signals to the skin and the joints. So it's really fascinating. But what's key to a healthy gut microbiome is the diet we eat. So next slide. We started to get a hint that this might be important from this sort of observational study published last year. And what the study asked was, why is there such a big difference between the outcomes from the pandemic virus between different countries? Could diet be responsible? And it analysed diet data in different countries and noted that with the increased consumption of fermented foods, there was a reduced mortality by about 1/3. And also that eating cruciferous vegetables, particularly cabbage, reduced the severity. And they postulated that this might be because fermented vegetables and also cabbage and cruciferous vegetables activate the transcription factor NRF2, which we know controls inflammation in the immune system. And in fact, people have been talking about how to activate this compound NRF2 to combat the adverse outcomes of COVID-19. But we can do it by food. Now, of course, this doesn't show food cause and effect, but what it suggests is that it might be a useful thing to keep our gut microbiome healthy. Next slide. A better study that came along earlier this year looked at the health of the gut microbiome by analysing stool samples in 100 people who'd been hospitalised in China. And they looked at the composition and found that the gut microbiome is associated with disease severity, and that it also impacts the level of the blood inflammation markers and the level of tissue damage created by the virus, and that the more severe COVID-19 you have, this was associated with depletion of those bacteria that are known in regulating the immune system. And also these abnormalities persist even after you clear the virus, suggesting that the gut microbiome might be important in this newly described syndrome of long COVID. Now, of course, we don't know if this is cause and effect. We don't know if we improve the health of our gut microbiome, whether we'll have a better outcome from COVID, but it really does make a lot of sense. So next slide. So what we can do to improve the health of our gut microbiome is concentrate on having foods that are rich in prebiotics that feed the bacteria, and these are abundant in our plant-based diet. So onions and garlic and asparagus and beans and oats and soya, and really incorporating fermented vegetables and foods might be really important in promoting gut health. And this is easily done on a plant-based diet. You can ferment at home or buy products that are fermented, such as kimchi and tempeh and sauerkraut. And we know one of the key factors in promoting gut health is the diversity of the plant foods we eat. So more than 30 different plants a week is really associated with better gut health. Next slide. And we've had a lot of chat about vitamin D. It's crucial in the health of our immune system. We know that people who are deficient in vitamin D have a higher risk of respiratory infections and infections like influenza. So, of course, it could be important in COVID-19. And now we've had a meta-analysis of 14 studies looking at vitamin D levels and COVID-19. And there is a significant association between low levels of vitamin D and a higher risk of actually getting COVID-19. So we must make sure we've got enough vitamin D, and if we're not getting enough sunshine, then we need to take adequate supplementation. Next slide. So what we're talking about here is aspects of our health that really can be benefited by eating a healthy plant-based diet: fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, remembering to use water for thirst. Tea and coffee is absolutely fine, full of polyphenols and health-promoting compounds. Eating a portion of nuts and seeds, which is crucial for cardiovascular health, and remembering to get adequate sources of vitamin B12, vitamin D, and iodine. Next slide. And this is because we have data prior to the pandemic that plant-based diets can reduce inflammation, reduce cholesterol, reduce glucose, prevent diabetes, even reverse it if you need it to. It can protect the endothelium through eating lots of nitrate-rich green leafy vegetables. Beetroot is also rich in nitrate, and also antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds in herbs and spices and dark vegetables and fruits are really important to protect this vascular layer. And of course, we've talked about the healthy gut microbiome. Next slide. So we finally got 2 large studies that show that a plant-based diet may be key to pandemic resilience. The first study was nearly 3,000 healthcare workers, mainly physicians from 6 different countries, who reported their diet habits, and it was looked at whether they had COVID-19 infection, and if they did, how severe it was. And the study showed an association between a plant-based diet, which had a 73% reduction in the risk of developing severe COVID-19. Conversely, people or physicians who were eating a low-carb diet that was high in animal products had a 3-fold increased risk of severe COVID-19. Now, despite the headlines, this was not a study of vegans and vegetarians, and the participants weren't particularly eating a healthy plant-based diet. But what was noted was that those who were described as plant-based were eating more vegetables, beans, nuts, and much less poultry, red meat, sugar-sweetened beverages, and alcohol. Next slide. We have a much more robust study that was literally just published last week in the journal Gut, and these brought together data from the now famous Zoe COVID app study, and it brought together data from 500,000 participants in the UK and the US. And what it showed was that when you analyse the data on diet and you classify it using the healthy plant-based diet index, which gives positive marks for healthy plant foods, negative marks for unhealthy plant foods, and also negative marks for all animal-derived foods, what they found was that a healthy plant-based diet reduced the risk of COVID-19 by 10%. That means you had a 10% less chance of actually getting the virus, which is quite phenomenal. But the major impact was on the severity. So you could reduce the severity of COVID-19 by 40% if you had a healthy plant-based diet. And the researchers concluded that based on these diets, what they calculated was that nearly a third of COVID-19 cases could have been prevented if these differences in diet quality and wealth had not existed. Now, to comment about that, what they found was a healthy diet really had the greatest impact in those of lower socioeconomic means. So this disparity in socioeconomic outcomes with the COVID-19 pandemic really could be addressed by addressing the quality of diet. Next slide. So this just shows the abundance of these health-promoting compounds that are present in a healthy vegan diet. It's full of vitamins and minerals. It's full of nitrate-rich vegetables. We've got herbs and spices full of antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds. We've got vitamin C. We've got flavonoids, and drinking teas like green tea are really important. So we need to have an abundance of healthy plant foods and nutrients. Next slide. So I just wanted to share a pandemic story with you. And this is my dad on the left-hand side. He's actually turned 78 now. He's got quite a complicated past medical history, which included a Whipple's operation back in 2004 that actually removes a portion of your pancreas. And people who've had a Whipple's have got an increased risk of diabetes. So it's quite a wonder that my dad took over 16 years to be told he was pre-diabetic. And that happened in September 2020. When he went for a routine check and was found to be overweight, which of course we knew anyway, but his triglycerides were sky high and he now met the criteria for pre-diabetes. Now, I wasn't sure that he was going to be able to reverse this, but we thought we'd give it a very good try. And he saw my friend and colleague who you'll be hearing from, Rohini Bajekal, who helped him adopt a healthy plant-based diet. And I have to say that it's got to be noted that he'd been vegan for the last 3 to 4 years. So, saying you're vegan doesn't mean you're having a healthy diet. So Rohini helped him adopt a healthy South Asian diet full of vegetables and lentils, daily walks, resistance exercise. And I'm happy to say that in April of this year and until this day, he's now reversed his pre-diabetes and brought his triglycerides back to normal and maintaining a healthier weight, although he does need to be a bit less because South Asians really need to have a BMI less than 23. So it's never too late, and really you can make a change in a short period of time. Next slide. So hopefully what I've covered and convinced you about is that diet is a single most important risk factor that's impacting our health, both from the communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases, that underlying health conditions caused by an unhealthy diet increase the risk of severe COVID-19, that inflammation, high cholesterol, high glucose, that can all be combated by a healthy plant-based diet, are really contributing to COVID-19 severity, that we should be concentrating on the health of our gut microbiome as a key to reducing the risk of severe COVID-19. And now we have 2 large studies showing that a healthy plant-based diet might be important in reducing the risk and severity of COVID-19. Next slide. So I leave you with this quote from this excellent editorial written in the BMJ journals. It says that it seems clear from the data available that nutrition is one of the keys to global pandemic resilience, both the current and future pandemics, and could reduce burdens on healthcare systems. Optimum nutritional status is a defense against both communicable and non-communicable diseases. It is also something that can be attended to right now and is not months away. We are ecological creatures at a crossroad. Let this pandemic be your wake-up call. Next slide. So if you want to optimize your diet and want a bit of support, then Leila Dakan has created this 21-day email support. So sign up for free on our website. Next slide. If you want to have a one-to-one consultation or a group consultation about your diet, then reach out to us on Plant-Based Health Online, where we will help you optimize your diet and lifestyle. Next slide. And I offer this course at Winchester University if you want to take your nutrition knowledge to the next level. Next slide. And some shameless advertising. My book, co-authored with my sister, will be out in January 2022, but you can pre-order it from all the bookstores right now. So thank you very much for listening, and I might have a couple of minutes for some questions if there are any.
Thank you, Shireen. That was very interesting. And, what I really find actually interesting was the part about the impact on diet, even if there are any socioeconomic, differences, because COVID-19 obviously highlighted those health disparities. But adopting a whole food plant-based diet could make up for some of that. That's really interesting, isn't it? So.
It really is, and I think that that's key to policy going forward, that a healthy diet is accessible and affordable, and we do our bit about educating people how to put that together in practice. But yeah, we need to make sure that it is accessible to everybody.
Thank you. So there aren't any questions. I think just people saying how great the presentation was beautiful, and they really enjoyed it. And I can just second that. It was really very useful, and I think very important, considering that we are still in the middle of the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So next, we have Dr. Sunil. Dr. Sunil is a qualified culinary medicine coach. He's a personal trainer and a scientist. And he has actually a very interesting talk prepared for us. And just to mention, if you have any comments or any questions, just type it in the comment box, and I will make sure to ask at the end of the presentation. So, Sunil, are you there?
Yes, I'm there, Leila. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hi.
Great. Good afternoon. Great. So thank you, Leila, and thank you for Dr. Shireen as well in terms of what you're doing with plant-based health professionals and the opportunity for me to be able to talk today. Shireen gave an amazing talk and a case study and said it's never too late. And I'm shifting gears to look at the other side of the age spectrum. And I'm going to talk about modern day considerations with millennials and Gen Z when we talk about plant-based diets and health considerations. Leila's already mentioned my credentials. Aside from that, the reason why I went plant-based is that I've had Crohn's colitis with IBS for over 7 years, and plant-based science and evidence-based science has really inspired me to change my culinary habits, but also help coach others to make that kind of transition and positive long-term health gains. So when we talk about the generations of the ages, I just wanted to provide a context of when I'm talking around Gen Y or millennials, these are individuals that are born between 1981 and 1994 to 6, whereas Gen Z, which is our newest generation, are born between 1997 and 2012. Where you all fall, you can use this as your kind of inspiration in terms of what label you are. Regardless of the labels, what we are realizing that obviously is today's young people differ from yesterday's. Every generation has had an environmental, a socioeconomic, or an event that labels or characterizes particular traits that will define the way that we perceive and the way that we act and the way that we actually form our ways of life, our morals, and also actually our diet lifestyles. You'll see that Gen Z are really consumed around being more ethical and around this centering values of uniqueness, whereas Gen Y are all about experience, flagships, and more of a globalist opinion. And this really shapes and forms how we, as either healthcare professionals or just individuals looking to make considerations in what we eat, will also frame what we do in terms of a lifestyle and diet considerations. So this gives a really important consideration, which is a millennial a millennial a millennial? And it's really important that we discuss the fact that there is a lot of discussion in terms of social evidence and social studies around the different archetypes that define a particular generation. By using such heavy labels as a millennial or Gen Z, we're grouping a cluster of generations, but making a lot of assumptions. And these assumptions could define how we view or perceive the diet and considerations, the nutritional considerations of different people. And I particularly like this quote from David Greiner, who's a well-known journalist, who said, if there's one thing that every millennial hates, it's an overly broad generalization of what every millennial thinks. And as a millennial, this resonated to me drastically so, because this has also shaped the way that I've gone through my personal healthcare journey, in terms of sometimes healthcare professionals or even individuals as millennials, we tend to make broad assumptions and general considerations on how we should go about making different considerations in our diet and lifestyle. So it's really important in terms of why I felt this important topic would be of use in Global Veg Fest. And I think it's characterized by a number of factors. First is we need to recognize that from an economic standpoint, millennials have reached what we feel are now the most important age range. So we dominate the workforce in terms of middle and senior management, and have the largest generation of management and disposable income. Gen Z account for 32% of the world's population and are now pipelined as the most influential generation of our time. Now, these are quite stark kind of thoughts around the modern day generation, but it really does frame in terms of what we think as scientists, as healthcare clinicians, but also as the broader generation, in terms of why is it so critically important, and why do we start seeing far more marketing generated around these core groups, but also why there's been such a transition in plant-based and vegan dining and marketing to tailor and cater for these generations. But it doesn't stop there. So we're seeing more and more growing evidence that millennials now make up over a third of all vegans. 25% of young British millennials now find that going vegan is more appealing, especially with COVID-19 having an impact. Now, Shireen spoke beautifully and eloquently around the impact of COVID-19, and particularly diet strategies that can help combat or reduce the risk of severity in COVID-19 or hospitalizations. And you can see now that this is the forefront of younger generations' minds in terms of what we eat and the impact it has, not just on health years and outcomes, but also in terms of traversing the pandemic that we're facing today. Also, when we look at socioeconomic and psychosocial outcomes in terms of questionnaires and marketing generation, we're noticing that Generation Z do want to be meat-free by 2021 and beyond. So there's definitely a need and a drive to meet the growing demands, and it falls on us all now to actually have those due responsibilities and see and actually speak to drivers of global change and how we meet those needs. And we all know that one of the factors other than health is around climate change and the climate responsibility that we have as citizens of this planet. And it's quite stark in terms of the numbers, where 41% of Gen Z feel that climate change is the single most important issue. So let's have a quick look in terms of the influences and confounders in terms of what defines and helps impact the decision-making of younger generations. There's no escaping the fact that the younger generation are a digital generation. We embrace information gathering, dissemination, and our understanding of information through digital and technological means. We also know that technology is adapting at a faster rate than innovation than the Industrial Revolution, which is extremely apt for the UK, as we were the center and the hub of growth during the Industrial Revolution. We're also noticing that mobile-first information is a growing expectation. This is going to shape the way that we all work together and also drive that information and needs to actually make those positive lifestyle changes. Where we are able to access and digest information, digital experience is extremely important. And these numbers show you in terms of how much the internet is driving decision-making and also how we can drive an impact. There's a definite growing need and desire for globalization compared to previous generations, and this is shaping our trends in food. There's definitely a globalization in terms of our food tastes and preferences, and we're noticing that 43% of US millennials are now non-white, so there's definitely a dissemination of ethnic flavors, ethnic networking, and then despite China's former one-child policy, it has 400 million millennials. So we are definitely shaping the way in terms of strategy, food diversification, and the growing needs. A really interesting fact is that if half the world now uses a smartphone, 75% have access to a mobile device. So you can see where this is also impacting fake news and also disinformation and misinformation. This is where we all as a global community really need to help drive that forward drive of information. Social networking is a key factor in terms of the way that we deliver and disseminate and digest information. And I've mentioned the power of misinformation and disinformation. And we're noticing this actually plays a critical part, especially when it comes to the vegan movement and plant-based diets and information, especially when it comes with climate change and the political agenda. And it's also impacting decision-making and the buying power overall. So this really shapes the overall ecosystem and network of how the younger generation really do drive their decision making. And then also we need to consider the fact that mobilization is also a key factor in terms of the way that we drive our decision making, and also how veganism and plant-based eating is really being able to be mobilized across the global network. Personal globalization is very key now. We're noticing that there's limitless cross-border movement, communication, and economic power decision-making and movement of money. And we're also noticing that today's school leaver is expected to have at least 17 jobs across 5 careers and live at least 15 homes in their lifetime. This is obviously going to have a huge impact on diet and lifestyle. And this is where actually making the right decisions and considering what are the health needs of the younger generations will really shape and inform why going through a plant-based lifestyle really does help meet the growing modern day needs. And finally, this is just an information as an FYI. Visually stimulating communication is going to be ever more paramount and of importance for the younger generation. We're seeing that YouTube is the close second global search engine. And we're also noticing that the preference around communication is around visual stimulation. And this is driving the way that the global movement of veganism and plant-based eating is really driving this decision-making as well. So let's talk more around the health trends and what are the growing concerns of the younger generation, also how plant-based and vegan foods really do meet those growing concerns of health trends, as we know that this community is going to be the largest global community in the world when it surpasses 30% in the next few years. Some of the food trends are particularly around street food and a preference around eating out. So there's definitely a departation from at home, that social dining at the dining table, to actually embrace more street food and accessible, convenient foods. I've already mentioned that there's a progressive departure from traditional to ethnic dining. And you'll see some of these statistics really show this stark transition from at-home dining and cooking to more complete meals and pre-prepared meals. This obviously from a healthcare perspective also is a watch out in terms of when we look at not just COVID, but long-term health conditions and communicable diseases, where combining plant-based eating and pre-prepared foods, we need to consider the trans fats, the unsaturated fats and refined sugars, and how that will impact the younger generations as we start going forward. Interestingly, the eating habits are particularly different to older generations. We're noticing that 23% of Gen Z prefer snacking and smaller meals. But we're also noticing that the celebrity endorsement is encouraging energy-dense and nutrient-poor foods and beverages. And this is where really advocating plant-based foods is really going to counteract this growing endemic and pandemic of obesity and IGT, so impaired glucose tolerance and pre-diabetes in younger generations. And so healthy habits is coming as a foremost need in healthcare professionals. So Shireen already spoke briefly around about psychosocial impact and where diet plays a role. And I won't dwell a lot on COVID-19, but we need to also remember that for the younger generation, although they haven't all been grouped by many global governments as vulnerable groups, they are having a global impact in terms of maladaptive health habits. We're noticing the highest rate of clinical significant anxiety in the modern age, and COVID-19 related concerns that is traversing into the workplace and at-home lifestyles. Interesting data in China as well is coming out that we're noticing that more younger individuals are developing anxiety and depressive symptoms as a consequence of COVID, and that socioeconomic status does play a consequence to health disparities and access to food. And this is a growing concern, not just in school children or children of school and educational age, but also of millennial and Gen Z age as well. So in terms of the health issues that are as a growing concern in the younger generation, where plant-based diets can really play a part, I'm going to cover 3 key and core concerns. The first being mental health. This has obviously gained a lot of traction in the public eye, and the data is stark and harrowing. And when we look at US data, there's very little in the UK, but in the US, we're noticing that there's a large exponential recorded rate of growing increase in, despite the generation and despite the race, of growing anxiety order and symptoms in the younger generation. We're also noticing that there's substantial increases in colorectal cancers, and this is data taken in high-income countries, which includes the EU5 and the UK. And the graphs below show that when we take different subtypes of colorectal cancers, so proximal, distal, or rectal, you'll notice that the trends are showing a substantial increase, and we're seeing that slowly growing in the younger generation of concern as well. And then finally, gut health. So Shireen again spoke a lot about gut health. Gut health is extremely close to my heart, and we've spoken about the power and impact that the gut microbiome and gut health plays in terms of overall linking immunity, skin health, brain and respiratory health. But we're also noticing that this data has been taken from market research, that 74% of those with gut issues report frequent bloating, constipation, and 50% of younger generations, in particular millennials, are noticing that they suffer from these symptoms in every single week. We notice that this is a consequence of poor gut health, and surprisingly, although that a lot of these millennials feel that they're meeting their 30 grams of fiber recommended daily allowance a day, only 8% of millennials are actually reaching that. So this is also playing a pivotal part in why millennials are suffering in these types of conditions linked to poor gut health. So the important question here is, knowing that we know that there's different subtypes in terms of the archetypes and what's driving the decision-making and influences of millennials and Gen Z, but also what are the health concerns? The most important question is, does tailoring interventions and plant-based diets really help in the younger generations? There's an abundance of data in looking at chronic illnesses in the working population and older generations, and slowly there's more and more information coming about around the younger generation. So I won't go through all this information, but it's really showing that, for instance, in mental health, there's already strong evidence in the emerging field of the microbiome gut-brain axis, and that there's a significant correlate in terms of the risk factors for depression and anxiety disorders and the symptoms with an unhealthy diet. We're slowly seeing that nutritional intervention is playing an important role in brain health and function, as well as mood, because it provides a rich abundance of polyphenols, antioxidants, but also neurotransmitter function and survival in terms of the maintenance of serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, but also GABA, which helps us with the strong influence between the brain and the nervous system. And this data is slowly showing that this is actually down to an altered microbiome status, also systemic microbial and metabolic alterations, which is obviously helping to reduce the factors around impaired glucose tolerance and metabolic syndrome, which could play a part in dysregulation in cognitive function and mood. When we look at colorectal cancers, there's a strong understanding that an oversupply of heme iron, which is typically found in meat and red meat in particular, plays a strong atherogenic and growth promoting influence, especially in GI cancers. And we know that there's evidence around how this is then being degraded into TMAO, which not only influences cancer risk, but also atherosclerosis and increases the factors and risk factor for heart disease. We also know that saturated fats typically found in animal-based products are impacting the gut microbiomes, which impacts the function of bile production and the acid pool, generating tumor-promoting secondary bile acids. And we know that animal protein favor these taurine conjugations and the TMAO hydrogen sulfide genotoxic compound release. And the last column there shows you, though, we are seeing some evidence that if you start implementing plant-based or vegan diet, it does confer a reduced risk, namely around the proportion of 15% in the incidence of total cancer. When we look at gut health, we are starting to see, and there's an abundance of evidence showing that a typical westernized diet, which is typically low fiber, high fat, and high carb, which is obviously supported with an animal-based diet, is leading to severe dysbiosis, which is obviously an imbalance in the gut-friendly bacteria with the more toxic and atherogenic promoting gut bacteria, which is ubiquitous in IBD and IBS. Some of the bacteria that are promoting these changes in dysbiosis are named in the study, showing that actually these are the promoting issues around IBD and IBS, where we can actually see higher remission rates in symptoms, particularly in IBD and IBS, with a higher fiber and a promoting diet through plant-based items, and a plant-based diet where it favors the bacillo bacteria. So what are the final considerations when we look at this overview of data? I think we first need to be mindful of the stereotyping of generations, knowing that our needs are very different. The way that we will consider and take on a plant-based diet will also change in terms of the convenience and accessibility. And so we need to consider how we make plant-based and whole food products more accessible to the younger generations, and also consider how we impart information, knowing that the power of digital really does inform decision making, and also that younger generations are now going to form the largest demographic, and that they do have many health concerns. I've only touched on 3, but there are so many others in terms of skin health. Gut health is an increasing issue around the younger generations, and we're seeing that plant-based diets really do play a supportive role through different underlying mechanisms, not only just through the gut microbiome and SCFA release, but also in terms of helping the immune response and also that central nervous link between the gut-brain axis. There's also a drive now that we need to be able to support younger generations through a more considered approach. And that's why options like holistic coaching, the plant-based health professional online coaching and support really does help people take them on the journey of supplementing the right plant-based diet. And a key note here is we shouldn't forget the Generation A. So Generation A are children born between 2012 and onwards, and these will continue through to 2025 and are most likely going to be the largest population, surpass Gen Z. And we're noticing a transition where the younger generation of millennial parents and Gen Z parents are imparting a vegan diet to these younger generations. We need to ensure that there's a balance of veganism and that the power of plant-based dining and eating and the positive healthcare benefits that it can play. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening. It really was a whirlwind tour of younger generations and the considerations. There's a lot more deep diving and a need for more research in this area. But please do feel to reach out should you want more information or support on coaching. And with that, I'll hand back to Layla, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Sonia. That was very interesting, I must say. I really enjoyed it. I think it's such a actually interesting topic and very relevant because, so many parents actually reach us to us, how can I talk to my children about it? And as you mentioned, we shouldn't forget about those younger children. And I'm just going to go through the questions first. I have a question myself, but let's just go through the questions. Do you think there is too much emphasis do you think too much emphasis is placed on nutritional aspects of health and not enough on the spiritual aspects of health, such as prayer, transcendental meditation, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the reason why there's more of a nutritional focus is because if we put COVID aside, and I think COVID has obviously hyper-escalated the nutritional aspects of health on the forefront, I think nutrition has always been the go-to and the foremost understanding of why plant-based diets do play an active role. And when we look at the needs of younger generations, other than climate change, health and nutritional aspects do actually define why they make the decisions of transitioning into diets. There's nowhere, and there's some limited evidence. I know there's evidence in IBS and IBD, where if you look at the spiritual influence of things like hypnotherapy, meditation, yoga, it does play a positive effect. I think over time we'll start noticing the holistic effects and then work on communications. Fortunately, at the moment, it is focusing mainly on nutritional, but it will change.
Yes, and also one of the things I noticed when you were talking about, when you're doing your presentation, is the anxiety levels, which are actually increasing in younger generations, especially because of COVID. And I think actually meditation, yoga, these holistic kind of practices could actually probably help with that. So hopefully it will be part of the, how we approach the younger generation. So another question, actually that is my question as well. How do we support younger people to make healthier choices and enjoy cooking, as well as we all have the problem of consuming too much processed food and eating out a lot?
Yeah, so I think that's an amazing question. It's the reason why I do what I do. I think there's many factors. I think the first is awareness and information. I think there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation about plant-based eating and how it isn't accessible and how hard and complicated it is. And I think it needs to start at a kind of much higher level, governmental. I'm not going to go down the political route, but I think if we start talking about how fruit and vegetables are cheap and accessible, that actually counteracts many of the hurdles. The other part then is actually driving initiatives at different levels of society. So starting at school, working at the corporate level in terms of with colleagues and with the employee base, and governmental and institutional level to show this is how accessible plant-based foods are. This is how easy and creative you can be with dining. And also just working with the right individuals. So plant-based health professionals being one, Layla's a coach, I'm a coach. We do a lot of things, and it's all about showing and encouraging the power of creativity through plant-based eating. And I think then finally, it's all about the supply and demand story. I think once we start showing that there is more of a demand, the prices become lower, the accessibility becomes easier, you start seeing more availability in your common restaurants. And I think that's when the taboo and stigmatization of plant-based dining reduces, and it will become the norm over time.
Yes, I agree. But at the same time, how do you feel about fast food establishments like, McDonald's, Burger King, having all these plant-based options?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting topic, and it can meander in a number of ways. And I had a really interesting conversation on an entrepreneur in the plant-based space, and I think it's because there's different levels or transitions going to any dietary change. I think the first is awareness, and I think this is why corporates like McDonald's and other large chain are showing the availability of, and I don't want to call them plant-based items, but more vegan items, to show that actually it is available, it is accessible, and it is tasty. But I think the huge responsibility falls on individuals like us to actually then transition them to more healthier choices. Unfortunately, we're not there as a global community. There's been a huge battle just to start getting accessibility and more access to vegan foods, and to show that actually, one, they're tasty, one, they're affordable, two, they're affordable, and three, you can get them in, round the corner in your corner shop. I think then there's this new transition of the health, and unfortunately, the corporate world sometimes does take precedent in terms of, it's the way that the marketing is. The muck plant burger is now the same price as a beef burger, where many of us would argue, well, actually, you'd think it would cost cheaper than the beef burger. But I think there's a transition. I think we will get there. We just need to keep pushing the nutritional advantages of why we need to make it more accessible.
Yes, and I saw something in Starbucks recently. They usually call their cakes like kind of vegan. Well, at least they did until a few months ago. Now it is plant-based. So we have this cake full of fat, sugar, but no salt, and it says plant-based. And I think it just confuses people even more.
Yeah, and I think we've got to be very mindful, especially with the younger generation, because the way that corporations market, and because we're such a digitally savvy and accessible community and generation, we're going to believe that eating something plant-based is far healthier than something that's vegan, and we feel it's still actually meeting our personal values of the climate positivity, the animal cruelty positivity, and the health gain. This is where there's a lot of work that needs to be done at an institutional level to talk about the differentiation.
Yes, we still have a lot of work to do.
Yes, it'll keep us busy, Leila.
And I think it is actually, we just had a very short time available today, but I think it's such an important topic, as I said, because parents who are vegan, but they actually follow a whole plant-based diet, who understand the health aspects, struggle. How do they get the message across to their children? How do they get them on board? And then there is these plant burgers, out there. So it is not easy. It's very challenging. So I really appreciate what you are doing. Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and from the feedback we can see here, people enjoyed it a lot as well. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So next, the last talk actually today is Rohini Bajekal. She's a nutritionist and lifestyle medicine practitioner. She's also the communication lead at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, so a colleague of mine. And she's going to talk about the nutrients of concern on a vegan diet. Hi, Rohini. Oh, you are mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me clearly now?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. I'm using my new microphone, so thanks for bearing with me. And thank you for having me and organizing this amazing lineup. And really excited to speak to everyone here, and hopefully won't keep you on for too long discussing nutrients of concern on a plant-based diet. So can everyone see my slides? Let me just... I appear to be sharing them, but Pete, are you opening them for me? Sorry, I've got them open, but I don't know why they're not being shared. Sorry, everyone. Not quite sure what to do. Yeah, I think if you share them, that would be great. Because I have them open and it says that I'm sharing them. But for some reason I can't access them in this system. I'll just do the introduction whilst everyone waits for the slides to show. So my name is Rohini Bajekal, and I'm a nutritionist and also head of communications at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK. So I'm going to be talking about nutrients of concern on a vegan diet, which is a topic I'm really passionate about. Next slide, please. Thank you, Pete. So why am I here today? Unhealthy diets are now responsible for 1 in 5 deaths globally every year, around 11 million deaths in total, making diet a leading risk factor for chronic disease, disability, and death. And this came out in The Lancet recently. And it's really important for all of us. And we know that plant-based diets have an advantage in so many ways when it comes to prevention, management, and even treatment of chronic diseases. But we also know that unfortunately, all plant-based diets aren't created equal. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there can be a real variety in the quality, the nutritional quality of different vegan diets. And I've been there myself, eating a lot of kind of vegan fun foods and junk foods when I was at university and not thriving the best way possible. So this talk is really a whistle-stop tour through the key nutrients to pay attention to on a plant-based diet. Hopefully it won't leave any of you feeling that you need to become a qualified nutritionist in order to get the nutrients you need, but it will stop, hopefully, the lack of awareness and education, and go a bit towards stopping the lack of education and awareness around plant-based diets and how easy it is to actually get all the nutrients with a varied whole food plant-based diet and adequate supplementation. And some of these foods, like the Oreos, are sort of what we call accidentally vegan foods, but they certainly don't really offer any nutritional benefits. And similarly, if you're living on sort of iceberg lettuce salads, you also won't get the nutrients that you need on a plant-based diet. So just raising awareness of this is so important. It's something that we're really passionate about at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK. Next slide. So just to reassure everyone who's listening, especially those of you who are new to plant-based eating, well-planned plant-based diets can support healthy living at every age and life stage. And that's the official statement from the British Dietetic Association and is backed up by other leading nutrition and dietetic bodies, such as the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the largest organization, which is based out of the United States. Next slide. So there are several nutrients that are important on a plant-based diet, and hopefully this isn't going to be too much, but I just want to touch on some of them, including some, that the first one, protein as well, where there are a lot of myths around that, and the key nutrients that I think it's important to just have an eye on, especially if you're new to plant-based eating or you want to know exactly kind of where these key nutrients are coming from. But just to reassure everyone, if you are eating a varied whole food plant-based diet, you really are covering most of the bases, as you will see in the course of the presentation. So let's kick off with protein. Next slide. So this is the most common question. I know everyone is probably sick of death of hearing, where do you get your protein? And the good news is if you are eating a varied diet that's rich in whole foods, there really isn't generally a problem with getting enough protein, particularly if you're getting enough calories for your energy needs, and including legumes. So included legumes is a really key source of protein. And I think whilst it is easy to get enough protein on a plant-based diet, it doesn't mean that protein isn't important. We need protein for adequate muscle and bone mass. We need it for immune health, for healthy hair, skin, everything, and growth. Of course, it's such an important nutrient for growth. And so there are, specific changes in the amount of protein you may need depending on whether you're an athlete, or, for example, if as you get older, there is some evidence to show that you may need to get more nutrients from protein. So I try to include about 2 to 3 portions of legumes every day. And these are some of my favorites, such as beans, lentils, peas, and soya. And whilst all whole plant foods contain all 9 essential amino acids, legumes are particularly rich in the amino acid lysine, which is important, as these are the best sources in a plant-based diet. You can also include whole grains and pseudo grains, such as quinoa, buckwheat, and oats. And nuts and seeds also contain a good amount of protein, such as almonds, pistachios, hemp seeds. 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, for example, contains around 8 grams of protein, and the average woman needs about 45 grams of protein. So it can really add up when you look at it in the context of your meals for the day. Next slide, please. B12, if there's one nutrient that is key for people on a vegan diet, especially to supplement, is B12. So it's made by microorganisms in the soil, not by plants or animals, but meat, dairy, and eggs are sources of B12. And often, as we know, factory farm animals are supplemented with B12. But it's really important to ensure a reliable source of vitamin B12. And it's really easy to do. B12 supplements are cheap and widely available, and even mild deficiencies can result in fatigue, and then there are more serious consequences such as anemia and even damage to your nervous system. So I recommend taking a supplement every day or fortified foods 3 times a day, and you need to get around 10 micrograms daily or at least 2,000 micrograms weekly. But as I mentioned, there are some sources of in fortified foods like fortified nutritional yeast, some meat alternatives, fortified plant milks as well, but you do need to be getting those around 3 times a day. So I think a supplement is generally best. Next slide. Calcium. We automatically associate calcium as needed for strong bones and teeth, which is of course why it's really important. But it also is important for healthy muscle and nerve function. And in the UK, the RDA for adults is 700 milligrams a day. And it's very achievable on a plant-based diet, but I do recommend opting for fortified plant milks and yogurts. Currently in the UK, organic plant milks and yogurts may not be fortified with calcium. So I always try and go for unsweetened, fortified plant milks, particularly soya milk, if you can find it, and yogurts. and then including a variety of low oxalate green vegetables, as oxalates can often bind to calcium and reduce their absorption. So I love rocket leaves, broccoli, watercress, bok choy, and kale, and then plenty of legumes, looking for calcium set tofu, chia seeds, almond butter, and really try and avoid calcium thieves. So high intakes of sodium, caffeine, and alcohol can really inhibit the absorption of calcium. Next slide. Vitamin D leads on really nicely from calcium, as vitamin D aids the absorption of calcium in the gut. And vitamin D is actually made by the action of UV rays on our skin. Most food sources are poor, and there are, in a vegan diet, there aren't really any natural sources of vitamin D. So you want to go for foods that are fortified with vitamin D that can be a useful addition, like plant milks and yogurts and mushrooms that are treated with UV light. But it's really always best to take a supplement. And some dermatologists are advising people to take a supplement all throughout because of the risk for skin cancer. People with darker skin, such as me, might need more than this. So I aim for about 25 micrograms a day. And vegans should really consider supplementing throughout the year if possible. And then there are specific needs for certain people. So people who are housebound, people who have PCOS, older adults, they may need slightly more. But always seek the advice of your healthcare provider. This is not intended to be individual advice, of course. Next slide. Iron is another really, really key nutrient, but it is plentiful in a very plant-based diet. Iron deficiency affects a third of the world's population, with particular risks in pregnancy and so on. And people who menstruate do need higher amounts of iron. It's about 14.8 milligrams in the UK, and that's the RDA for people who menstruate aged between 18 and 64. And avoiding heme iron found in animal foods such as red meat may actually reduce the risk of certain cancers, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease. But if iron is something that you do want to focus on, make sure that you're including beans, oats, dried apricots, dark leafy greens, nuts and seeds, and really avoid, again, as with calcium, you want to avoid things like red wine, coffee, and tea with meals. And another thing that can help, there are lots of other tips out there, and we have some great tips at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK about this, but pairing vitamin C rich foods with iron rich foods. So berries on porridge, strawberries in your green leafy salad, or broccoli in your red pepper and tofu stir fry as an example. Next slide. Zinc is a micronutrient, and it plays a really key role in growth and immune health. Men need slightly more than women, as it's lost in semen emissions. And sources include beans, lentils, tofu, whole grains, wholemeal bread, nuts and seeds. Plant sources aren't zinc isn't as abundant in plant sources, so you want to include a variety of these. And I love having things like red lentils, pumpkin seeds, variety of these kinds of foods, and you'll be fine that most vegans are actually meeting the recommended daily amount as well. So that's really good to know. And just supplementing without a reason rather than getting it from whole plant foods isn't advisable unless you have a specific condition such as something like PCOS. Long-term zinc supplementation can actually result in copper deficiency. So you just want to be careful before automatically turning to a supplement when you can get some of these micronutrients from a varied whole food plant-based diet. And to counteract inhibitors of absorption, such as phytates in grains, it's really helpful to get into soaking, fermenting, and sprouting. It's very cheap, and you don't need fancy equipment to do any of this. But by soaking and sprouting grains and legumes, you significantly reduce the phytate levels. And this really helps you absorb micronutrients such as zinc and iron. So it's something that I highly recommend for everyone. If you can get into it, there are some great YouTube videos out there. Next slide. Iodine. So the UK is, out of all kind of developed countries, the UK is one of the most iodine deficient. We don't iodize our salt here. And I recommend taking a daily 150 micrograms. So you only need a very small amount of iodine in the form of potassium iodide or potassium iodate, especially in preconception, pregnancy, and breastfeeding. And at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, we recommend that vegan people who are planning to get pregnant or are pregnant or breastfeeding take 200 micrograms per day. Iodine plays a really critical role in early brain development, so it's not something you want to be deficient in. And amounts in seaweed can be quite variable. So some types can be contaminated or too high, and that can actually increase the risk of things like hypothyroidism. So hijiki seaweed, as an example, should be avoided. And then dulse and nori are good sources. And if you enjoy those, you can sprinkle them on a stir fry or in a salad, for example. And fortified plant milks and yogurts, there are more and more brands now adding iodine in, but always check the label to see if it all adds up, because you do need to make sure you're getting that good amount, and those are good options. In the UK, we don't really have iodized salt available here. As we know, we need to be generally reducing the amount of sodium in our diet, so it's not something we widely recommend. Next slide. Selenium is another one that doesn't get enough attention, because it's a trace mineral, but it's really important for healthy nails, skin, hair, immune health. There's so many other functions, but plant-based sources contain really variable amounts, and some of the better sources are things like Brazil nuts and cashews, and porridge oats are actually a good amount, particularly if you're having steel cut oats or oat groats. So that's the more intact version of the whole grain. And if your brown rice is also a good example, and beans. And the UK RDA is 75 micrograms a day for men and 60 micrograms per day for women. So again, just tiny amounts. And I like to get my selenium by having 1 or 2 Brazil nuts per day. You don't want to be having too much. Too much selenium can lead to a condition called selenosis. So it can end up giving you the opposite. So brittle nails and hair and things like that. So you want to be sticking to just a small amount. And multivitamins often contain selenium. The Veg 1 supplement from the Vegan Society has a good amount as well. So that's a good option if you don't like Brazil nuts. The UK soils, I think, are particularly selenium deficient. It depends. Different countries have different selenium levels in the soil. So we are a little bit more at risk here. And that's why I think it's a nutrient to pay attention to. Next slide, please. So omega-3 fats, last but not least, this is a really important one and it has got more and more attention recently. So we can actually get plentiful alpha-linoleic acid, which is the type of omega-3 fat that you can find in abundance in plant foods such as walnuts, ground flax seeds, hemp seeds, chia seeds. I do prefer to you need to really grind your flax seeds and chia seeds to be able to absorb all of that beneficial alpha-linoleic acid. And that's a great thing that you can top on to salads, soups, dal, smoothies. It's really versatile. So I aim for 1 or 2 tablespoons a day, or you can have 6 walnut halves as an example. But vegans should really be getting good sources of omega-3 fats in a day, and actually reducing your levels of omega-6 rich fats, such as by having, if you're having a lot of processed foods and things like that, can actually help with your ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. An algae-derived DHA and EPA supplement is a prudent choice. We don't have an official recommendation on it, but at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, we do advise that if you are trying to get pregnant, you're breastfeeding, you're feeding children or older adults, it might be a good choice. And this also avoids the pollutants in fish, such as mercury, dioxins, polychlorinated biphenyls, and obviously the environmental damage that is caused by fishing. So I would strongly recommend getting one of these, and we have the specific amounts on our pregnancy fact sheets if that's something that you are interested in looking into in more detail. And again, there's so much evidence still coming out about omega-3 fats. I personally do take the supplement to be prudent, especially when I remember, but I really focus as much as possible on getting good sources of ALA into my diet. So all of the things I mentioned, like the walnuts and the flax, go really nicely with breakfast, but they can be added into other meals as well. And they're really cheap and easy. You can buy the whole seeds and grind them yourself at home. And where possible, do try and store them in the fridge or freezer, as those delicate oils that are released when you grind these seeds are prone to rancidity. So you just want to keep them, store them properly and use them up, hopefully quite quickly. Next slide, please. So now we're coming to sort of towards the end of the presentation, and I really want to emphasize the importance of making smart swaps when you're transitioning to a plant-based diet. And that means making prudent choices. So don't just remove the meat from the plate, but actually replace it, and think about zinc, iron, calcium, micronutrient-rich choices like beans and lentils, tempeh and tofu. I really cannot wax lyrical enough about legumes. They are so important, such an important food for longevity, so high in fiber, so high in protein and other micronutrients, and just so versatile. You can have it in bean-based things like cannellini bean spread or hummus. You can add tofu into stir fries or tempeh. You can make Indian dishes that would have had paneer, but using tofu as a replacement. And obviously the abundance of chilies and dals, and even British dishes like shepherd's pie, you can do with a lentil shepherd's pie. And similarly with milk, if you're removing milk from the diet, please replace it with fortified plant milks. Soya is always my personal preference, as it's such a good source of all 9 essential amino acids and has so many other health benefits. And other calcium-rich plant foods, it's important to prioritize those. So you want to aim for about 2 cups a day of calcium-rich plant foods like dark leafy greens, the ones I mentioned, and calcium-set tofu. And really try and think about that when you're making a meal. I now try and make it priority to include a type of legume. So it could be peanut butter on my porridge or tofu in my stir fry. I just try and make it a priority. And that is such a great way to get in all the nutrients I've mentioned without leading to overwhelm. You might be sitting there thinking, gosh, I need to plan all these different nutrients, but it really is about making these smart swaps. And make plant-based versions of your favorite meals. There is nothing that cannot be veganized. And there are so many great cookbooks out there, and you can, you don't need a cookbook, you can just try and experiment yourself. But there's lentil bologneses, tofu pad thai, cashew mac and cheese. Rather than using a shop bought sauce, you can just blend up some cashew nuts with nutritional yeast and some soya milk, and that makes such a delicious and creamy sauce for pasta. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, this is really how I approach eating, and so much of what we've talked about touches on kind of the science, the RDAs, all the specific nutrients and their various health benefits. Although, of course, I could have done a presentation on each of those nutrients because there's so much nuance there. But I really want to summarize on this note that if you're eating whole plant foods and supplementing adequately, with the key nutrients, you don't need a whole cupboard full of supplements. You will be getting the nutrients that you need. You can be confident in that. So really try and base your meals around whole plant foods. It doesn't mean that there isn't room for having treats, here and there. And certainly some things like certain meat alternatives contain highly digestible and absorbable plant protein. I still don't think they're a contender for beans and lentils and tofu, but they have their place, certainly, in some cases. And aim for 10 daily servings of colorful fruits and vegetables, particularly dark leafy greens and berries, which are foods that I include every single day. And opt for whole grains. Try and go for the intact whole grains where possible, like brown rice, quinoa, steel-cut oats, and then pseudo grains that are particularly high in protein and iron and calcium and zinc. So I love amaranth and buckwheat and things like that. And try to get in 2 or 3 daily servings of legumes, such as tofu, beans, peanut butter. So 2 tablespoons of peanut butter is a serving. And then with tofu, you want to aim for about 80 grams. And include sources of healthy fats, such as avocados, nuts and seeds, again, prioritizing those whole foods as much as possible. But things like tahini can make wonderful calcium-rich salad dressings and is really delicious and tasty. And add in fermented foods. There is such a plethora and variety of fermented foods in different cultures around the world. I'm South Indian, and we have things like dosa and idli, but there's, kimchi, sauerkraut, injera, which is a fabulous fermented teff bread that originates in Ethiopia. And try to make sure that you are supplementing with those key nutrients. So you can take an all-round multivitamin like the Veg1 supplement, but you can also take individual ones if you prefer. And B12 and vitamin D are really key, but do consider other supplements that you may need. So iodine or algae-derived omega-3. And then if you have other conditions on top, for example, if you menstruate and you have very heavy periods, you may need an iron supplement, and it's really important to get the right medical advice. If you have PCOS, you may find that taking chromium or myo-inositol is really helpful, but you do need to get that advice from a proper qualified health professional. This is not a one-size-fits-all, but really, supplements cannot replace an unhealthy diet, but it's important to make those sound choices, such as the B12 and the vitamin D. They are really, in my opinion, non-negotiable. And next slide, please. So I just want to end on this note, which is something I always come back to, which is it's not about what you're giving up. It's about all the things you're embracing. It may seem that there are a lot of nutrients. I don't really even like the term nutrients of concern. It's more like nutrients to embrace or be mindful of. There is so much that you're embracing by including all these vibrant, delicious whole plant foods in your diet. So really try and go in with that mindset of abundance, filling your plate with color and a variety of foods. Next slide. And lastly, I am the communications lead at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, and I cannot wax lyrical enough about the incredible resources we have. We have hundreds of incredible fact sheets, webinars, videos, articles, an incredible 21-day challenge. So do tell your friends, family, colleagues, neighbors, everyone about it, because these are all completely free. And obviously we would love if you would join us as a member. What I've shown there is the Plant-Based Eat Well guide, which is a much more in-depth version of everything I've discussed. And we have fact sheets that dive into detail on more of these nutrients. We have a specific vitamin D fact sheet or a pregnancy fact sheet, for example. And whilst this has really been, a huge amount of information that's packed into 20 minutes, I really urge you to go and check out the site in your own time and peruse it, because there is so much to learn there. Next slide. And lastly, I would love to hear from you. I have so many tips on my Instagram page at Rohini Bajekal. Also follow us at Plant-Based Health Professionals, and we're at Plant-Based HP on Twitter and at Whole Foods Plant-Based Nutrition on Facebook. So we are active on all of those social media accounts, and do follow us, because we're always posting about the events that we're part of, the latest nutrition evidence as well. And I also offer one-to-one consultations, and you can go and visit my website for more details. And thank you so much. And then the last slide, if you could just show it, it's the references for the talk, but you can email me and I will send you all the references from everything I've mentioned. And if there's anything you had questions about, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohini. That is such an important topic. And I think, we need to cover that from time to time, because just eating a vegan diet doesn't mean that it is completely healthy, but it can be, as long as you are aware of the nutrients. And we have a few questions actually for you. There was actually a question which was asked after Shireen had already left her presentation. It was about vitamin B12. I know you already covered it, but I just want to ask it anyway. Do we have to take a vitamin B12?
We absolutely do. I know that there are still myths around vitamin B12, and it's true that, we do store vitamin B12 in our body, but what we found in studies which, there was a study, I think, in the 90s, which looked at vegans in the UK and who had quite serious vitamin B deficiency, and it led to things like not only fatigue but also higher rates of nerve issues and dementia. So it's a really serious problem, and anemia is no joke, nerve damage is no joke, dementia, it's just something that is so important. And as we're learning more and more, factory farmed animals are also supplemented with vitamin B12, and that's becoming increasingly common. And so why not, cut out the middleman? You don't need to eat meat, eggs and dairy to get your vitamin B12. Just take a supplement. It's really cheap and affordable. And I can't emphasize that enough, because we have actually seen that it's true that by the time you go vegan, you will likely have stores of vitamin B12, although they have found that there are many meat eaters who are also deficient in B12. As soon as you stop supplementing with it, the levels actually start dropping quite quickly. And so just taking it every day, you don't need very much, but it's just quick and easy. Or you can take the supplement twice a week, 1,000 micrograms twice a week. That's also an option. But yeah, I can't go on about it. If there's one nutrient from this talk, it's vitamin B12 that you just need to supplement.
I agree. I think it is non-negotiable, to be honest. Just it's a must. So next question: is it okay to take 75 microgram of vegan vitamin D3 per day as a way to protect against COVID?
Okay, so I think like the evidence on COVID isn't, as sound. It's not that there's hard evidence on vitamin D, but it certainly is helpful not to be deficient in it, and does play an important role in immune health. That is obviously on the higher side, although the upper limit is 4,000 international units for adults in the UK. I'm not with 75 micrograms. I think
3,000. So it is still
it is on the higher side, and taking really high amounts of vitamin D is actually toxic. So you want to be ideally having about, I would say, 1,000 micrograms. 800 to 1,000 is, unless you have a reason. So, for example, people with PCOS, obviously I'm passionate about this because I have PCOS myself, have been found to have low levels of vitamin D. So it's actually helped to take slightly higher amounts. But I would again seek the advice of your healthcare professional, because everyone has different needs. I know that for myself, with darker skin, I need higher amounts than my friends who are white British people. They don't need as much as I do. So I can't give individual advice here, but it's best to check. And also you will probably be getting a small amount from fortified foods as well, so plant milks and so on. But it's great that you are supplementing. I think it is a really important nutrient. Even in the UK, we're advised everyone, regardless of their diet, to take vitamin D, especially from September to April. But many of us find that we're actually low throughout the year.
Okay, thank you. Actually, yes, vitamin D toxicity is possible, and it happens because of supplement and over supplementation.
Yeah.
But yes, the upper limit is 100 micrograms, so 4,000 you need. But again, and vitamin D toxicity can actually lead to calcium being more absorbed, and that can cause some problems. So just check, your levels. We should all have our levels checked once a year anyway.
I completely agree. The best thing is actually just to get a level done. There's no, that's if you're unsure, and to also just ask your GP, because we unfortunately can't give individual advice on this platform.
Thank you. We have actually 2 more questions, but we have.
Okay, I'll try and go as quick as I can. Oh, do we have time?
Is choline an issue? Choline on a plant-based diet, is that an issue?
Plant-based sources of choline, there are good sources of choline on a plant-based diet, but you want to really include things like cruciferous vegetables and beans and so on. And, certain people may need to also supplement in pregnancy specifically. Otherwise, I would not recommend a choline supplement. But really, you want to be getting in those cruciferous vegetables anyway. Cruciferous veggies and beans and things like that, they are just so important to include. And I know a lot of controversy around brain health and choline, but there really isn't the science to show that vegans are worse off when it comes to that. So yeah, if you're eating a very whole food plant-based diet, you should be you should be fine.
Yes, and tofu is always a good source. Thank you.
Tofu is a great source. Yeah.
It's 2 o'clock, so we are going to just wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed your talk. And just to let you know that all the talks are recorded, so you can find the recordings later on VegFest YouTube channel. And the live streams are available on their Facebook page. And we have more talks tomorrow planned. We start at 12:30. I hope that you join us tomorrow as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very excited. Thank you so much. And looking forward to the rest of the talks. Thank you, everyone. And do connect with me offline.